The closed and the open in the two sources of morality and religion, a distinction that changes everything, by Frédéric Worms, translated by Alexander Lefebvre and Perry Ravon. It may appear presumptuous to maintain, as I will do here, that a distinction, especially one set out in a philosophy book, could change everything. That is, even change everything in our lives. I must therefore immediately make clear that it is not the book itself that changes everything. Bergson, in publishing The Two Sources of Morality and Religion in 1932, would certainly not have made such a claim. If there is something that changes everything, as Bergson does in fact claim, and as I also believe is the case, it is not his book of philosophy, nor even a distinction inside that book, even one between the closed and the open, if by that one means that the book creates the distinction out of thin air. If something changes everything, it is the distinction between open and closed moralities, religions, and societies, inasmuch as this distinction effectively exists. One effectively appears, observable and active. If something changes everything, it is the difference between the closed and the open, not as it appears in a book, but first of all, in life and in human history, to the point of becoming, perhaps today more than ever, its primary and ultimate source of orientation. But this does not mean that a book of philosophy or philosophy itself is good for nothing and changes nothing. Quite the contrary. For if the distinction appears in history, and even if as soon as it appears we immediately sense its full significance, this does not mean that we find it explicitly set out there alongside its criteria, that it is demonstrably established as primary, and that it does not also run into concurrent forces that cloud its effect. The role of philosophy and the philosopher may well be secondary compared to those who bring this distinction to life in history, but it is no less an essential one. In setting out and establishing this distinction in the specificity and scope, it also contributes to its practical effect. This is, without a doubt, Bergson's goal in The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, right down to its title. The book will change something, while establishing that a distinction changes everything. This certainly explains, in any case, why the distinction between the closed and the open, by itself, commands the whole of Bergson's two sources. Once again, perhaps more than ever, a fundamental intuition is expressed through a distinction that in turn governs a whole field of experience, according to Bergson. An intuition to be grasped both at the most intimate level and in the widest variety of its effects and consequences. Such was the case in the early works, with duration and space, with memory and perception, and with life and matter. The distinction between the closed and the open will also express an intuition and a simple act that goes even beyond philosophy this time, and through philosophy, it will resonate throughout the field of morality, religion, and society. But if this is the task of philosophy and of writing, two sources, it is also the task of understanding or reading it. This is therefore my goal here, to grasp the meaning or structure of the whole book based on the distinction, it being understood that one expresses the other. In order to do this, I will begin from the end of the work. Indeed, it is at the end of the book, more specifically, at the beginning of its fourth and last chapter, just when he draws out the consequences of the theory of morality and religion as he just presented, that Bergson brings it back explicitly and in its entirety to the difference between closed and open. Taking this indication as my guide, we will proceed in 4 stages. We will start from the beginning of the 4th chapter in order to understand how Bergson subsumes the whole book under this difference. We will then return to morality and to religion, respectively, which were presented in the 3 previous chapters. That is, I will return to the moral criticism of the difference between the closed and the open, and then to the religious expansion or deepening of this difference. We will then be able to go back to the 4th chapter in order to understand what this distinction changes in practice, in our lives and history, both in 1932 for Bergson and for us today. The closed and the open, the conclusion and opening of 2 sources. It is only at the beginning of the 4th and last chapter of 2 sources, titled Final Remarks, Mechanics and Mysticism, that one fully grasps the scope of the difference between the closed and the open that has been established in the 3 previous chapters. More specifically, here Bergson explicitly entrusts it with a double role. It must first sum up everything that came before. As the first sentence of chapter 4 states, one of the results of our analysis has been to draw a sharp distinction in the sphere of society between closed and open. It is therefore both morality and religion that are taken up anew here. Thus, with respect to closure, this religion, which we call static, and this obligation, which is tantamount to a pressure, are the very substance of closed society. But this is not enough. This distinction must also open new perspectives that form the true object of Bergson's last chapter, which is thus not only conclusive, or rather not only final, to take up the first part of its title, but also itself remains open. That is why what are here described as final are just remarks, an unusual term for Bergson. It is an invitation to go further. Or more precisely still, here is what the new problem is from the perspective of this fundamental difference. Quote, now, is the distinction between the closed and the open, which is necessary to resolve or remove theoretical problems, able to help us practically? End quote. It is, of course, important to underline the urgency of this now, which is not simply a logical step to a consequence among others. What must now be faced are the practical problems of the present moment. In 1932, as the us also emphasizes. But this may seem surprising all the same. While it is true with regard to morality and then religion that Bergson has been addressing theoretical problems, the criteria of morality, the principle of religion, we were hardly removed from political concerns. Only, on the contrary, Bergson had dismissively criticized all theoretical morality. He even defined complete mysticism as the transition from contemplation or ecstasy to action. How then do we make sense of the fact that this practical dimension remains in a sense wholly untouched, at least for us, on the threshold of these final remarks? How do we make sense of the fact that of everything that came before, all that apparently remains is the distinction between the closed and the open, as twin guiding threads, conclusive from a theoretical perspective, but still prospective from a practical one? This is the double question that ought to be answered. To do this, I will have to reconstruct Bergson's trajectory. In other words, trace the steps that lead to the conclusion before trying to understand what it also opens up for our action. Before proceeding, we shall make one preliminary remark in order to avoid a serious misinterpretation regarding Bergson's 4th chapter itself. It concerns its title, the first part of which I have already discussed, but whose second part must also be analyzed in order to rule out a potential misunderstanding, and more importantly, to elicit a new positive guideline for our inquiry. What, in effect, after the indication of final remarks, does the phrase mechanics and mysticism mean? Let me immediately stress, before demonstrating it later on, that the distinction between mechanics and mysticism in no way overlaps the distinction between the closed and the open. It is not the case, in other words, that mechanics should be closed and mysticism open. On the contrary, the entire goal of Bergson's chapter is to show how mechanics or technology calls on a form of mysticism, and how mysticism demands a form of mechanics. They can, indeed must, proceed in the same direction, even if there is risk or danger that precisely consists in the possibility of them being separated. Everything that is at stake in this chapter lies within this. Mechanics and machines are described there as the stage reached by a humanity that has always, for Bergson, been defined by technical ability and intelligence, homo faber, but that now finds itself, more than ever, torn between the closed and the open. This, then, is the significance of the practical utility for us now. The closed and the open can and must assist the direction we give to this modern, super powerful technology, which can either lead to unheard of destruction on the side of closure or turn more strongly than ever towards openness. Bergson, therefore, in no way condemns us to a terrible choice between a purely warlike mechanization and an ecstatic mysticism without any technical support. We can leave that to others. The freedom of humanity now requires this new alliance between mechanics and mysticism, one beyond the dark, doubly closed one made by war, where technological power serves not mysticism, but myth, mythology, ideology, and fabulation. To get there, however, the distinction between the closed and the open first has to, as we shall see, run through the morality and religion of Bergson's previous chapters. To these, therefore, we must return. It is once again with a consummate writerly art and sense of the composition of a book that Bergson introduces the distinction between the closed and the open in the first chapter of Two Sources. It is a genuine coup de theatre, or burst of thunder, heralded, moreover, by the witches of Macbeth. Everything had effectively moved at the speed of light up to that point, without any preamble. Bergson had moved from the fact of obligation to the immediate location of its double social principle, indeed, vital principle, in a virtual instinct required by life to counterbalance the disorder introduced by human freedom. Morality seemed thereby to be given a foundation, a biological foundation, to be sure, but nevertheless, one that is universal, omnipresent, and in any case, in every society. Bergson even insists on this point. What is natural is in great measure overlaid by what is acquired, but it endures, almost unchangeable, throughout the centuries. To it we must revert to explain what we have called obligation as a whole. Our civilized communities, however different they may be from the society to which we were primarily destined by nature, exhibit, indeed, with respect to that society, a fundamental resemblance. End quote. The logical conclusion, then, is that the principle of obligation does not change with history. It is the same everywhere. Its necessity and universality are thus confirmed. There is no distinction to be drawn between primitive and civilized. On this essential point, they are alike, equivalent. Yes, but the resemblance that the paragraph concludes with is not the one you would expect. The whole of obligation is transformed with extreme abruptness into a wholly different thing in the next sentence. Here is the resemblance between these natural human societies, whatever their place in history. For they too are closed, he said. Why does the whole of obligation turn into closure, totality into limitation? Why is this fact fundamental, so fundamental, that it actually calls for a whole other morality, one that is not only universal this time, in virtue of its vital foundation, but also in virtue of its object, in virtue of those for whom it is valid or to whom it speaks? What is it that immediately proves this difference? What immediately proves it to us, according to Bergson, is a simple fact that turns everything on its head. The reversal of values precisely heralded by the witches of Macbeth. Fair is foul, and foul is fair. This fact is war. We need only think what happens in time of war and what effectively happens during war. This, quote, murder and pillage and perfectly cheating and lying, because not only lawful, they are actually praiseworthy, end quote. If such a reversal of values is possible, it nevertheless has a simple explanation, according to Bergson, summed up in the term closure. Certainly, morality has not lost its validity. It simply reveals that it was only valid for members of a given society to the exclusion of others. It reveals their limits or closure through its own. Such is the very simple and literal definition of closed society. They may be very vast, but their essential characteristic is nonetheless to include at any moment a certain number of individuals and exclude others. What could be simpler? A closed society is one that does not include everyone, that marks a spatial limit, a frontier, an exclusion. But this spatial closure is immediately moral. Where the society stops, so too does its morality. This closure, therefore, is not just a simple fact, but a serious problem. It is not simply a case of Pascalian relativism. Quote, truth this side of the Pyrenees lies on the other. It is, end quote. It is even more serious. Quote, thou shalt not kill on this side of the Pyrenees, thou shalt kill on the other side, end quote. The boundary does not represent a relative difference, but an absolute change. Not truth here and lies there, but a prohibition here and an obligation there, not only to lie, but also to steal and kill. These are not two relative truths, but two absolute imperatives that contradict each other. And the boundary can fall within the same territory as soon as it isolates groups and identities. In short, this fact revealed by another fact, the disclosure revealed by war, is not just one aspect among others of societies that hitherto consider themselves moral or on the whole of obligation that seems so self-assured. It radically upsets them. Everything is thus clear-cut. But we need to go a step further. It is obvious that this closure is not directly consciousness of itself, or at least not consciousness of itself as immortal. On the contrary, there is a sense in which we can only perceive, articulate, and, in any case, denounce this closure from another point of view, one that defines, or rather calls for, another morality. It is only from the perspective of this other morality, whose object is what Bergson calls here, straight away, man as man, or the whole of humanity, that closure can be taken as a limit, not only a factual or spatial one, but moral and absolute. Thus, it is not only closure that is revealed, but also, by the same token or with the same indignation, the openness that is radically opposed to it. We mustn't believe, however, as Bergson immediately stresses, that the difference between the two is not absolute. If the closed only appears as closed from the point of view of the open, it doesn't mean there is not what Bergson calls here a difference of kind and not simply degree between them. Quite on the contrary, in the very feeling revealed to us by the fact of war, in our indignation before it, an absolute leap is revealed. And immediately, the move from a closed society to an open society, from a limited society to a limitless society, cannot appear as a simple expansion, because it would then have to include that extreme and also immediate figure of closure, the enemy. The fact of war alone already prohibits us from conceiving the passage from closed to open as a simple expansion. But Bergson has to insist on this point, and us with him. Quote, between the society in which we live and humanity in general, there is, we repeat, the same contrast as between closed and open. The difference between the two objects is one of kind and not simply one of degree. End quote. Even the image of closed and open, with their suggestive spatial force, leaves no room for doubt. It is all or nothing. We can invoke another figure here who, like Pascal, hovers behind the scenes throughout his admirable book. It is the same here as in Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of the Inequality of Men, where he imagines, quote, the first man who enclosed a piece of land, end quote, invented property. With a single enclosure, all is closed. For Bergson, too, this is how history can radically shift. The same principle is at play here, but it also runs in the opposite direction. For Rousseau, we move from a hypothetically open origin, the so-called state of nature, to the enclosure and inaugurates history. For Bergson, we move from a factually closed origin to an openness that demands effort and action, but that similarly represents the real start of history, or in other words, the only thing that is truly new under the sun. A genuine critical problem is thus raised. How do we attain open morality? While its criterion is given in a single stroke, it also so demands that we must surely postpone its possibility for its reality and achievement. But perhaps we should say the opposite. For Bergson, it is precisely because this morality has already been realized and made possible that today we have a sense of it. And this is the reason why war or hate, even if we can't always avoid them, at least makes us indignant. But this paragraph, where everything is transformed and decided, he is more or less satisfied to raise the problem to abstractly indicate two possible solutions. Quote, whether we speak the language of religion or the language of philosophy, whether it be a question of love or respect, a different morality, another kind of obligation supervenes, above and beyond the social pressure. So far, we have only dealt with the latter. The time has come to pass to the other. End quote. There are two possibilities, therefore, for the universal: reason or love, philosophy or religion. But there are also two mistakes to avoid. First of all, even if Bergson comes down in favor of religion and love, it will certainly not be by way of relegating reason and philosophy to the side of closure. From Socrates to Kant via Spinoza, the various moral philosophies are already on the side of the open, even if, according to Bergson, they lack its most active principle. But they already and decisively break ranks with the war instinct. But in addition, Bergson does not philosophically deduce or construct religion or even open morality. These exist as a matter of fact, and the philosopher cannot invent them. This is what the rest of the first chapter demonstrates in its discussion of the great moral figures. Without them, the philosopher would not conceive of the criterion of the closed and the open, any more than he would be scandalized, even by war. It is nevertheless true, having stressed these 2 points, that from this point on, there is something like a call to the problem of religion. To this we must turn. A religious deepening. The transition from morality to religion is not, in the two sources the transition from a fact to its foundation, but rather it is a transition from one problem to another, one that may be deeper, but is still analogous and turns on the same problem and the same distinction implied by the principle. It is by going back over the same grooves that the distinction between the open and the closed takes on an even greater scope. And just as the moral criterion is amplified by religious experience, so this experience in turn continues to draw on the moral criterion, which will retain a definitive, in all senses of the word, character throughout the entire book. What then is this new problem? Why have the stakes involved, not only in openness but also in closure, as is too often forgotten, increased here? An immediate sign being the division, this time across two chapters, between static and dynamic religion, respectively. A brief attempt to answer these questions is required here. The problem that religion responds to is in effect analogous to the one to which morality, for its part, offers a response. As indeed the whole start of the second chapter of Two Sources shows, human intelligence introduced not one, but a double imbalance into life. It not only introduced freedom, to which obligation already presents some kind of response, it also introduces risk, doubt, a whole series of representations that threaten to distance humans alone among all the species from what Bergson no longer calls, as in his other books, attention, but rather attachment to life. Humans are the only beings, or only animals, if you prefer, who can entertain doubts about life. Hence, the most general function of religion, which Bergson sets out in two stages. One, quote, looked at from this first point of view, religion is then a defensive reaction against nature, against the dissolvent power of intelligence, end quote. And second, quote, looked at from this second point of view, religion is a defensive reaction of nature against the representation by intelligence of the inevitability of death. As we know, Bergson will distinguish two ways of responding to this double problem, static and dynamic religion, respectively. The first will consist in countering representation with representation drawn from within thought itself, drawn even from human intelligence, namely the fictions and myth resulting from the fabulation function. These fill the role of reassuring us and renewing our attention to life, but they don't take us outside the sphere of human nature, of the species. Even if there is an appearance of historical progress in the myths of the Greek pantheon, for instance, we remain in the realm of fable, where every child rediscovers and reinvents without knowing it. Dynamic religion, however, proceeds in an altogether different manner. It does not compensate the representation of intelligence with representations from the imagination. It goes beyond them by way of contact with the very source of life. This contact can be contemplative and simply frees us of our doubts. It can be active and make us go beyond the limits of human action. But in every case of what Bergson calls mysticism, dynamic religion provides us not only with security, but serenity, not only fiction, but experience, not only fable, but a genuine narrative. But what is too often forgotten, and what I want to stress here in a few words, is the way that this very distinction between static and dynamic in religion, and perhaps within each religion, is actually a revival and intensification of the distinction first established in morality between the closed and the open. Here again, Bergson's writing style is striking. It is at the start of the third chapter, at the moment we get to dynamic religion, that once again, all the results of the previous chapter are brutally put into perspective and turned on their head by the eruption, once again, of war. The contrast between the two religions is striking in many cases. For instance, when the nations at war declare that they have God on their side, the deity in question, thus becoming the national god of paganism, whereas the God they imagine they are evoking is a God that commands all humanity, the mere vision of whom could all men but attain. It would mean the immediate abolition of war. End quote. Thus, what must be stressed is the static religion is not only fulfills its own function as a static way, but also completes closed morality by further reinforcing the pressure that unites a group both within itself and against its enemies. Quote, what binds together the members of a given society is tradition, the need and the determination to define the group against other groups and to set it above everything. To preserve, to tighten this bond is incontestably the aim of the religion we have found to be natural. The fact that religion, such as it is, issues from the hands of nature, has simultaneously fulfilled two functions, the moral and national, appears unquestionable. End quote. What we need to take into account here is that it is not just a case of one fact that ties with another. It is a force that joins up with another, magnifying what becomes even more formidable obstacle. It is truly myth that welds the community together. Bergson speaks of fabulation, which may have drawn weary smiles. What of it? But this is serious business. What is constantly highlighted throughout the chapter is the ideomotor force of these imagery representations, which compensate on a practical level for a practical defect of our intelligence. Fabulation has and is a power. It was this that was already cause for amusement on the impressive first page of the second chapter. Religion has been known to enjoin immorality, to prescribe crime. End quote. Not only the same amusement return, but so too does the same criterion, this time redoubled. Of course, it may be argued that Bergson also suggests that the open has by the same token gained in strength and intensity. As a matter of fact, this will indeed be the case with mysticism. But before we even reach the point, it is important to stress the exceptional character of mysticism, even if it finds a place or awakens an echo in all of us. In reality, what Bergson calls natural religion here doesn't disappear any more than the morality of the same name. Even if it encounters its radically opposed other, it will continue to offer resistance. Who can gainsay Bergson on this point? But what is more often forgotten, and more seriously still, is that the very criterion of mysticism is to be sought, in the first instance, within the openness that would thus be opposed more than ever to closure. We rightly seek to characterize the metaphysical implications of mysticism. We wonder about the distinction Bergson makes between mystics. And yet, if there is one criterion of mysticism that ensures that it's not just anyone can call himself or herself a mystic, that ensures that there can be no mistake about the matter, it is surely the distinction between the closed and the open. Of course, it is possible to say that open morality is only fully open if it draws its strength from its contact with the principle of life, which only the mystic accomplishes. But conversely, this contact, especially for the complete mystic, expresses itself first and foremost in the aspiration to open morality. Thus, according to Bergson, the peak of mysticism is attained in Christianity. Nothing is more laconic than the nevertheless central declaration, the cutting edge of the whole book, in the third chapter. Quote, let us merely say that if the great mystics are indeed such as we have described them, they are the imitators and original but incomplete continuations of what the Christ of the Gospels was completely. End quote. In the first chapter on morality, Bergson had stated in advance what he meant by this. Quote, The morality of the Gospels is essentially that of the open soul, end quote. He added, quote, such is the inner meaning of the antithesis that occurred one after the other in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it, that it was said, I say unto you. On the other hand, the closed. On the one hand, the closed, on the other, the open. And this is true of the other mysticisms. I have elsewhere shown that each mysticism seeks, however, incompletely, to deliver humanity from one of its limits and essential sufferings. Metaphysical problems, life sufferings, and moral injustice are thus in a single angle of attack for the Greek, Oriental, and Jewish mystics. But all this had already been announced in the first chapter of the book through the lens of the closed and the open. Attention is thus usually riveted on a single page, on the third chapter where Bergson, having spoken about Christianity, speaks about Israel's prophets. But how can we forget what he had already said in this regard in the first chapter? Let us recall the tone and accent of the prophets of Israel. It is their voice we hear when a great injustice has been done and condoned. From the depths of the centuries they rise and raise their protest. End quote. It is almost as if we were, and in our own opinion, we are, hearing Charles Péguy in this quote, talking about Bernard Lazare during the Dreyfus affair. It is therefore indeed the opposition between the closed and the open that governs Bergson's theory, both of religion as well as morality. Yet far from this opposition finding only a foundation in mysticism, it also finds further difficulty. For while there have been mystics, without whom access to the distinction itself would have been impossible, once again, they are both definitive and exceptional, unimpeachable, and yet met with resistance. The great effort, the greater its reach, the more it reveals the force of the obstacle which ceaselessly returns. This is also why it should no longer come as a surprise at this stage of our journey that the book does not end with its third chapter. Certainly, in principle, everything has been said. We can even say that the absolute has made its entrance into history, or has opened up what finally, in the evolution of life, becomes history. In fact, however, everything remains to be done. We have at our disposal not only the words, example, and action of the mystic, but also a distinction, along with a philosophical force, to confront problems that can no longer wait. The closed and the open, practical perspectives. Here we are then back to our starting point, on which we will present three brief series of perspectives by way of conclusion in order to understand the practical implication of the distinction between the closed and the open, not only in the last chapter of Two Sources, but beyond. Everything effectively takes place as though the fourth chapter of the book was caught in some sort of in-between state, and in-between that is explicit and claimed as such, as well as being caught in an extreme state of urgency. On the other hand, the distinction between closed and open changes everything. More specifically, open morality and open religion institute a definitive break and novelty. On the other hand, however, it is precisely only the mystics or great moral figures who can practically implement the distinction in reality. So much so that in their absence, their exceptional and unpredictable absence, the distinction precisely falls back into a distinction that, while certainly not empty, while still real, risks being merely theoretical and ahead of its effects. The goal of the fourth chapter is thus explicitly to show that we cannot wait. In other words, that we can and even must immediately determine points of application that are accessible to ordinary people, insofar as they are themselves caught in the in-between that is opened up by the distinction, the in-between of intelligence, technology, and institutions. Furthermore, we must do so because these problems don't have to be invented. They are here. The war, its reasons, its means, and its dangers. on which we can thus act, in a sense, by default. We can't do everything. Only mystical effort is capable of that. But we can't do nothing. The dangers have become extreme. We must therefore act by diagnosing the problem, mechanization, and war, by using the distinction to orient ourselves. The mechanical calls on the mystical and vice versa in the direction of openness away from closure. By showing the fact that the oscillation between these two extreme poles in human history, an oscillation on which we can lean, dichotomy, double frenzy. In short, the whole fourth chapter invents a sort of politics of the in-between that is neither metaphysical nor without any metaphysical implication. In doing so, it takes a stance on problems that are both essential and urgent: the meaning of technology, the nature of democracy, contemporary war. This in-between, too often misunderstood, is far from being a weakness. It is instead a means of precision, strength, and a step forward. But everything happens as though the reception of the book had to side on one way or the other. For example, there is the demand to immediately realize mysticism, but Bergson had seen the resistance of closure and strength, of the mythical as opposed to the mystical. Far from what has too often been thought, it is because there are these two forces, intra-rational and warlike on the one side, super-rational and democratic on the other, that as long as the latter has not definitively defeated the former, with which it cannot be confused, we must rely on reason and intelligence. Two Sources is thus a treatise of all three orders, the infrarational, the rational, and the superrational. How could anyone have thought that Bergson favored just any form of irrationality? He distinguishes two more radical than ever: hate and love. When he states in a now famous interview that, quote, Hitler proved the truth of the two sources, end quote, that is indeed what he is talking about. Only Jesus, as always, and all the heroes of openness will answer him and win. But if their strength at a given moment is no longer enough, reason, although less powerful in itself, cannot but take up the baton, the weapons, and the responsibility of history. If pure mysticism is inaccessible, however, it would also be a mistake to give an entirely non-metaphysical significance to the distinction between the closed and the open, as had Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies, nevertheless one of its most profound adaptations. For Popper, the distinction becomes that between totalitarianism and democracy, the latter defined first and foremost by the openness of speech, information, and verification and refutation based on the model of science. He thus explicitly makes use of Bergson's distinction, without its metaphysical foundation, and in his own remarkably pertinent and powerful fashion. But it is possible that today, without necessarily returning to Bergson's metaphysics and the in-between in it outlines as horizons for action, we may be satisfied with a quasi-technical distinction that does not refer to a radical and even returning obstacle against which one must constantly struggle. This is at least the case in the three domains the book covers one by one. First, in the religious domain, more than ever, the distinction between the closed and the open seems to us to cut like a sword, not between religions, but within each religion. It shows the extent to which religion is not necessarily what frees us from closure, from the conflict between identities, and from hatred, but what strengthens these, while at the same time it is also, in virtue of the strength of an effort that exists in each one, what is opposed to all these things. It is thus both poison and antidote at the same time, not blended together, but as two clearly opposed directions, Bergson being one of the few to have set up an opposition between them. This is also quite true in the political domain. Democracy, as Bergson shows, is a direction more than an institution, an effort to be renewed rather than established structure. Its imperfection and readiness to fall back into closure should lead us not to abandon it, but to return to it. But I will conclude with a moral observation, namely that the experience of closure and openness takes place not only in the transition from the closed group to the whole of humanity, but also to every relationship between men and at all levels, from the vital individual relationships to the global relations on the scale of the planet. In this sense, this experience does not presuppose any transcendent metaphysics. It is rather the experience itself that gives a metaphysical significance, that is, an absolute polarity to all immanent relationships. In this sense, finally, it certainly does not change everything in a single stroke, as if that were possible, as if everything were not a fiction, but it absolutely does change everywhere something, not only through the philosopher who states it, but also through those who, without ever having to state it, make it happen.